this sheet of paper for purposes of evaluation. These materials will be collected before you leave the room, so this helps us assess what occurred during the session and during the symposium as a whole. And there's also a question in there as to the next edition, the 20th anniversary of the academic symposium, and what that subject matter could include. And more often than not, it's the folks like yourself that help us design and shape the academic symposium. So we go from 8 o'clock to 8:50. For those of you who are not familiar, my name is James Gray. I'm a professor here at Marian University, and I will more or less serve as a timekeeper for Sister Alice. So Sister Alice wanted me to dispense with any introductions and to launch into it, but please join me in a good and wonderful Marian welcome to Sister Alice. Sister.
Oh, mine?
Yep.
Russia is a vast and complicated country. Perhaps making some comparisons with the USA can illustrate this. That's why I have that little diagram there on the board. The United States on one side, Russia on the other. The total land mass of all 50 US states is 3.8 million square miles. But Russia does not have only 50 states. They have 89 different states, but they call them administrative regions, but the same as a US state, basically. And the Russian land mass is 6.6 million square miles. When I was a kid, fourth grader, living through the Cold War, I had a world map on my bedroom wall, and let me tell you something. I was way ahead of Trump in wishing that Canada could become our 51st state. I would look at that map and I thought, boy, joining up with Canada was the only way we could ever make the USA just as big and strong as Russia was. Here are some additional facts about Russia's land mass. It stretches across 2 continents, with 23% of its land being European and 77% Asian. While the U.S. shares land borders with only Canada and Mexico, Russia shares borders with 16 different countries that I've got listed up there. Just for fun, let's play a lightning round game. I'll name each of those bordering countries, and you raise your hand if I name a country you've never heard of before. Just for fun. Norway, okay, all of you heard of that one. Finland, Estonia, okay, if you never heard of that one. Latvia, okay, everybody knows Latvia. Lithuania, all right. Poland, how about Belarus? You heard of Belarus before? Okay. Ukraine, of course, Ukraine's in the news a lot now. How about Abkhazia? All right, got a few who didn't know that one. Georgia, and our Georgia doesn't count. South Ossetia, Azerbaijan, China, Mongolia, North Korea. Okay, so the countries that you didn't know, for the most part, were basically part of Siberia until various provinces of the old Soviet Union started breaking away and becoming their own free country. So, let's consider Russia's 4 oldest religions next. When Vladimir the Great converted to Christianity in 988, he required all his subjects to do the same. Later, when Christianity began breaking up into different denominations, The Russian Orthodox Church was founded in 1054. However, as Russia continued to invade and conquer its neighboring countries, Russian Orthodoxy was not forced upon the residents of those lands. They could continue practicing the faith of their ancestors. That is why Russia today officially recognizes 4 main religions as a long-standing part of their national heritage. Russian Orthodoxy in Russia today has about 130 to 140 million members. Islam, between 14 and 25 million. Most of those people do live in some part of Siberia. Buddhism, between 7,000 and 2 million Buddhists in the Russian state today. And Judaism, 82,000. It should be noted that Russia's Jewish population was twice that size before Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. This war frightened many Jews and caused them to flee to other countries. Jews always were kind of a put-down people in Russian history, and some of that anti-Jewish bias still existed in Russia when I was living there in the years 1995 to 2000. Finally, I need to mention that some 21.5 million Russians today are atheists. And these easily outnumber, for example, the country's Jews and Buddhists. Now let's compare their religions with ours. Although half the size of Russia and only 250 years old, we have far greater numbers of Christians, Jews, Muslims, and Buddhists. Our Christians number 220 million, Jews 7.5 million, Muslims 4 million, and Buddhists about 3.5 million. But we too have our fair share of atheists. According to the Pew Research Center, they number about 17 million. Hopefully this rundown has helped you see big differences between our country and Russia. What separates us the most, though, are our contrasting forms of government. When communism fell in Russia in 1991, it seemed possible that President Boris Yeltsin's struggling democracy would eventually thrive. He did not have all the answers to Russia's problems, but he certainly was searching for them. As I said earlier, I lived in Russia from 1995 to 2000 while serving in a Catholic church in Western Siberia. And I still closely follow the happenings over there. Today I will share what I have learned about Russia both from being there and from keeping up with the news about Russia ever since I left. First, I will admit I have a soft spot in my heart for Boris Yeltsin because he was Russia's first and only president who ever desired a democracy for Russia. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace has listed 5 important accomplishments that Yeltsin achieved during his 8.5 years as president. For the remainder of my talk, I will explain each one of his major achievements while adding information I gleaned from my 5 years of living there in the city of Chelyabinsk and interacting with the Russian people. Okay, Yeltsin's first big accomplishment was that he dismantled the Soviet Union without causing a civil war. Under his leadership, people from several different political parties, including the Communist Party, were able to run for president and for seats in Russia's Federal Assembly. This assembly consists of 2 chambers similar to our United States Senate and United States House of Representatives. The State Duma consists of 450 elected members who serve 5-year terms. The Federation Council, the other branch of their so-called Congress, consists of 2 elected members representing each of Russia's 89 different regions. Under Yeltsin, these two chambers of Congress, for them the equivalent of our Congress, had many duties that unfortunately Putin later modified, shall we say. During his first year in office, and that was in the year 2000, Putin eliminated the people's right to vote for two persons from each region to serve on the Federation Council. Instead, he appointed those two persons. In our country, that would be like letting the US president choose all 100 senators serving in the US Senate. In addition, Putin changed the main duty of those appointees of his. Their duty was no longer to debate issues and pass laws. Their duty was to rubber stamp each new law that Putin proposed. Now, 20 years later, another change Putin made was to allow the ex-president to become a permanent member of the Federation Council upon leaving office. And of course, he would be that person who might leave office eventually, we hope. Now, this would be kind of like if the US had a similar law, Donald Trump becoming a permanent member of the US Senate after finishing his presidency. Sorry, I have to laugh at that. But at least Trump, as far as we know, is not a murderer. Which brings up another well-known fact about Putin. Can you guess how many political foes he has murdered since his rise to power in 2000? A wild guess.
56.
All righty. Moving right along with my notes. He has averaged about one execution a year.
Oh, as well.
Yeah. In other words, it could be worse. High-profile men and women alike have been poisoned, shot, pushed out of windows. You've seen all of that in the news if you've followed it over the years. In each case, someone had in some way challenged Putin's popularity or his policies. I remember when a highly respected eye doctor died in a helicopter crash in June of 2000. My Russian friends immediately said, oh, someone wanted him dead. When I asked about that further, all they said was, oh, it's an old Soviet trick. Anytime they want to get rid of someone, they arrange a plane crash or a helicopter crash. To this day, I wonder if they thought Putin was behind this man's death. His name was Dr. Fyodorov, because he was quite popular in Siberia at that time. And he was also an elected member of the Russian Duma. He had run for president once before, but Boris Yeltsin beat him out. And the people in Siberia really loved that man, and they were hoping he would run again sometime. But he got knocked off. In Yeltsin's time, many different political parties existed. But these four attracted the most votes. Number one, the group with the largest number of membership were the Communist Party. And that was actually a wise move on Yeltsin's part to allow the Communist Party to continue to exist and influence legislation and be part of those two legislative chambers that I named earlier. So there were a large number of communists serving in office in their bicameral legislation. Another group called the Liberal Democrats, another group called the Yabloko Party, and the Our Home is Russia Party. I enjoyed keeping up with Russian politics while I was there, and I most identified with the values of the Yabloko Party. They were against foreign wars, and had some good ideas for building a strong middle class. If they had won more votes in the 1990s, and the 2000s, perhaps Russia would not have become what it is today. A nation run by one strong man, Vladimir Putin, and 155 Russian billionaires who will do Putin's bidding. Because if they don't, they might lose their life. Okay, that was a long bit of conversation that started with Yeltsin helped dismantle the Soviet Union. And they were a free country until the year 2000 when Putin was elected. But the next major accomplishment of Yeltsin that I want to talk about is this. He moved the country into a market-based economy by allowing, listen to all of these things, private ownership of gas companies, mining companies, TV and radio stations, utility companies, small businesses, residential apartments, agricultural land, and banks. Think about that for a minute. In our country, we take for granted private ownership of all these entities. Yet, from 1917 to 1991, the Soviet government owned just about everything there was to own. During the Yeltsin era, I enjoyed watching Russian TV after private ownership of Russian TV stations became possible. I soon settled on which TV news station I trusted the most. And I also enjoyed watching a weekly comedy called Kukli. It was a puppet show, kind of like our Muppets program on our American TV, except that its characters were all Russian political figures. And one of those puppets was a portly President Yeltsin. Now, for years, Yeltsin ignored all the jokes made about him on that program. For him, they were no big deal. But when Putin became president in 2000, he found the new Putin puppet offensive. And he immediately ripped that program off the air. Later, other programs from around the world began disappearing from Russian TV. Especially news shows like the United States' NBC News, England's BBC News, Germany's Deutsche Welle, and so on. In the Yeltsin years, 51% of Russia's TV stations were government-owned, as they had been in the Soviet times, and 49% privately owned. That was a big change from communist times, when all stations were government-owned and heavily censored. After Putin became president, though, more than 90% of Russian TV channels again went backwards. They became government-owned, and the Soviet style of government censorship returned to their airwaves. Today, 3 Putin-owned oriented news channels dominate the scene. 2 of those 3 are available to almost 100% of the Russian population. While the nation's senior citizens are most likely to get their news from TV, younger people living in larger cities are more likely to use their iPhones and computers to seek out the news. And they know, as I'm sure all of you know, who make use of these devices, they know how to stay under the radar when they listen to forbidden stations on their iPhones and so forth. My question is, will these young people be the ones who, in the end, save Russia? According to the organization Reporters Without Borders, since Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, almost all independent media have been banned, blocked, and or declared foreign agents or undesirable organizations in Russia today. In a conversation I had with Russian school teachers back in the 1990s, I learned that when they were in college, they had secretly listened to the BBC News from London on the radio. They would have been arrested if caught doing that, but they did it anyway. They were curious. They wanted to know what life was like beyond the Soviet Union. Maybe today's young Russians who seek alternative news sources on their computers and their iPhones one day will bring back the freedoms that people enjoyed during the Yeltsin years. That is certainly my hope. It does take intelligence and bravery, though, to get around some of Russia's current prohibitions. I maintain only one contact today with one Russian woman I knew when I lived in Chelyabinsk. She has a Facebook account where she only posts news about an animal shelter that she runs. She has over 1 million followers, many of them Germans who regularly donate to her shelter. She was both English-speaking and German-speaking. Aline and I, on Facebook now, just say hi to each other from time to time on holidays such as Christmas and International Women's Day, which, by the way, is one of Russia's biggest holidays. They love their women. But I don't want to get her into trouble by saying much more than hi. And by the way, I think she's kind of looking out after herself as well, because she made sure she got herself over 1 million followers on Facebook, thus making it a little harder for the spies to pin her down and find out what she's up to. Now we need to ask ourselves, could the United States be trending toward greater government control over us? What is happening with our TV and radio programs? Do pay attention to which United States billionaires buy out which stations, and note what kinds of programming gets promoted or canceled. Do some critical thinking. Why is Stephen Colbert's program going off the air later this spring? How did Jimmy Kimmel's canceled program get reinstated? Why has the U.S. Congress voted to defund public TV and radio after decades of support for them? What and who are they afraid of? Who will benefit the most from defunding these entities? The general public or the members of Congress who support Trump's agenda and don't want to fund public TV because it might just be too honest for their tastes? Why are some newspapers publishing softball stories about Trump and his cabinet while avoiding serious critiques of their performance? Why does the Washington Post have far fewer subscribers than it had just a couple of years ago before Jeff Bezos took it over? The content of that newspaper has changed since that one American billionaire took control of that one newspaper. And by the way, longtime subscribers to the Washington Post canceled their subscriptions not long after Bezos took it over and changed its content. According to media watchdog Robert Reich, a brand new pro-Trump media empire has emerged. Trump cronies Larry and David Ellison now own CBS, CNN, HBO, Comedy Central, and TikTok. Will CBS and CNN continue to be trusted news sources, or will they be heavily censored too? Will Comedy Central's South Park suddenly go soft on Trump? These are all things we need to watch for. Next major accomplishment of Yeltsin that I want to talk about. He oversaw the introduction of a new constitution for Russia, which increased civil liberties, freedom of speech, and freedom of the press. That's why it was possible for half the country's billionaires to own half the country's news stations at one time on TV. For the first time in their lives, Russians could demonstrate on the streets without being jailed if they opposed something their government was doing. A Moscow woman once explained to me how fearful of arrest she was the very first time she demonstrated on the streets. But Yeltsin was true to his word in allowing this kind of dissent. In a slightly different case, and I'm going to go all holy roller on you here, I myself felt great joy when our Catholic parish in Chelyabinsk could hold an outdoor religious procession in the summertime. There was a time when all of us would have been arrested for doing that. But Yeltsin gave churches that freedom. Russian newspapers and TV programs, after they no longer were government-owned and operated, openly critiqued policies endorsed by President Yeltsin. This meant that news reporters could honestly acknowledge government weaknesses and failures without being jailed, or shot, or pushed out of a tall building. Some of Putin's current favorite methods. However, Russia's brand new democracy still had one major flaw, and it was never fixed during the Yeltsin era. It lacked checks and balances on any possible presidential overreach. Yeltsin did sometimes abuse his power when he was president, but his successor, Vladimir Putin, took those abuses to a whole new level. Both Yeltsin and Putin profited from being president, even during some very difficult years for average Russians. Things got so bad in the 1990s that at one point, a Russian ruble was worth only 1/2 of 1 US cent. Eventually, the ruble bounced back, to the point where 1 ruble, once again, was nearly the equivalent of 1 US dollar. That's how it had been during the years of Gorbachev. 1 US dollar approximately equaled 1 ruble, 1 Russian ruble. So anyway, to get back to the wealth of Yeltsin and Putin, so when Yeltsin died in 2007, his net worth was 2 million rubles, about $2 million. Yet Putin's net worth by that same year of 2007 was almost 9 million rubles. Yeltsin 2 million, Putin 9 million. Then after another 10 years in office, Putin's net worth jumped to 200 billion rubles. How did he get so rich? In 2017, a former CEO named Bill Browder made an astounding revelation at a US Senate hearing. He testified that Putin had accumulated his wealth by forcing Russian billionaires to give him 50% of their earnings annually or else. These men had gotten rich by scooping up lucrative properties and businesses that once had been entirely government-owned during the years of communism. Now, Yeltsin never intended his country's most important assets to be owned by a limited number of lucky investors. In 1992, he tried to spread the country's wealth around with a vouchers program. Each citizen was given a 10,000 ruble certificate, and then was encouraged to spend it on shares in Russian industries. Unfortunately, his timing was off that year. Over the course of 1992, the value of the ruble fell like a rock, and that 10,000 ruble certificate became almost worthless. 1 ruble equaled 1/2 of a cent, US cent. People who had been saving up for a major purchase, such as a car or a family vacation, suddenly discovered that their savings were almost worthless. They were like miners learning that they had spent their entire lives piling up fool's gold instead of real gold. Even as the value of the ruble dropped to its all-time low, their salaries remained the same. And at that time, government-paid workers, which included teachers and doctors, earned between 400 and 1,500 rubles a month. Now, when the ruble has come down to being worth about 1/2 a US cent, well, you can picture that. It was a good salary before the crash, but afterward, all it could buy was groceries. Besides dealing with hyperinflation in 1992, government workers, along with retirees receiving monthly pensions, had to wait up to 3 months to get their paychecks. So what did they do? For one thing, they moonlighted, just as our lower class American workers need to do today. Teachers sold homemade items or canned goods from their gardens at outdoor markets on weekends, or they tutored children of the wealthy. Doctors working in hospitals made house calls for people with means, or they sold homemade wine at outdoor markets. In order to spend less money on groceries, everyone cultivated a big garden in the country every summer. They grew their own fruits and vegetables and did lots of canning every fall. If they lived in a house with a yard rather than in an apartment building, they could plant gardens and own their own chickens, geese, and pigs. If possible, they also owned a cow or a goat to save on the price of milk. Of course, this meant there was little variety in the food they ate. Soups and salads were the staples of their diet. A typical winter salad consisted of chopped up cabbage, carrots, and onions seasoned with salt and sunflower oil. Salt, by the way, was the only spice that they ever used. Another important dish was pilmeni. It consisted of small meat-filled pastry dumplings boiled in water and then served in a bowl with sour cream. The meat used for these dumplings was called farsh. It was a mixture of ground meat that was half pork and half beef. They never ate hamburgers or steaks or meaty sandwiches of any kind. Farsh would stretch so much further if used only for things like small boiled dumplings. So they had some hard times during that Yeltsin era. And eventually, things got straightened out, and today, the ruble and the dollar are again about worth the same. But I want to go on to another accomplishment of Yeltsin's during the time he was president. After he became democratically elected president, Yeltsin gave significant autonomy to his 89 different regional leaders, while also granting them a new title of governor. Before the Yeltsin era, Russian territories were broken down into these 89 different administrative divisions. Under communism, anyone assigned to manage a region had to be a Communist Party member and had to follow the instructions of Soviet central leadership. They couldn't make a move without getting permission from the big guys back in Moscow. So that system kind of would be like requiring all of our state governors today to take all of their orders only from the US president and to ignore whatever were the concerns of the residents of their state. In the old Soviet Union, sometimes a territorial leader had no prior knowledge or experience of the region he was assigned to direct. That's why these officials were nicknamed by the common people parachutist leaders. They just parachuted in and started bossing people around without knowing anything about people. Between 1994 and 1998, Yeltsin gave real power to governors. He signed individual treaties with 35 of 89 different Russian regions, allowing the people living in those regions significant autonomy and control over local resources, economic policies, and law enforcement. When Yeltsin ran for a second presidential term in 1996, he promised to allow elections for regional governors in all 89 regions, because initially it only allowed that to a few. And he actually kept his promise. So under Yeltsin, governors could oversee all economic, industrial, and social infrastructure within a region's borders. Governors also became automatic members of the upper house of the Russian parliament, which allowed them to influence legislation that affected their regions. Finally, sometimes in special situations, and this didn't happen too often, Yeltsin gave a regional governor permission to ignore one or the other federal law if it seemed to fit his region a little bit better, not to follow that law. It really was a tragedy that Yeltsin did not foresee the dangers posed by a Putin presidency. I remember speaking with a Russian woman as the election was approaching in March of 2000. Yeltsin resigned before his term was over due to ill health, and his appointed successor was Putin, and that happened on New Year's Eve, 1990, going into the year 2000. He appointed Putin to temporarily take over the presidency, but they had to run an election later in the spring. So unknowingly, Yeltsin set up Putin for lifetime control of the country. I remember speaking with a Russian woman as the election was approaching in March of 2000. She said she just didn't like the idea of a former KGB man becoming president. It turned out that this humble housewife could see what Yeltsin simply did not see. In today's Russia, it is sad that governors lack the independence they once had. Nowadays, what are their 5 main duties? Number 1, support Putin's policies. Number 2, provide soldiers for Putin's armies and social support for army families every time he starts a new war somewhere. Number 3, ensure big voter turnout for Putin and his United Russia political party at every election. In other words, rig the elections. 4, maintain economic stability in the governor's assigned region. And 5, maintain sister city relationships with the districts of Ukraine currently under Russian control. Not anything like debating and passing new legislation goes on in that branch of Russian government today. So being a Russian governor no longer means now what it meant in the Yeltsin years. Can you imagine what our country would be like if every state governor's first concern was keeping our president happy? How well would that work? Now let's look at one more accomplishment of Yeltsin's during his years in office. Yeltsin improved relations with the United States, which included a series of talks about reducing each nation's stockpile of nuclear weapons. For people of my generation, and probably Donna's, a few other people in here, this was big. In our childhood, every school had a fallout shelter in the basement where we were supposed to gather if the principal ever announced that we were under nuclear attack. As a little girl, my older sister used to beg my dad to build us a fallout shelter in our backyard. One morning when I was about 7, I woke up so scared about a nightmare about a nuclear attack that I just couldn't eat anything all that day. All these recollections came back to me one day when I entered a Russian hospital and saw on a wall an old-fashioned 1950s style plaque. It contained detailed instructions on what to do and where to go in case of an American nuclear strike. I respect President Yeltsin for his attempt to make a nuclear arms reduction agreement with the U.S. early in his presidency. In 1992, Presidents Yeltsin and George H.W. Bush held serious discussions about mutual nuclear arms reductions. At that time, Russia held at the ready between 27,000 and 35,000 nuclear weapons. The United States held about 19,000 nuclear weapons. Within 6 months, Yeltsin and Bush were ready to go to reduce their country's nuclear weapons to a number somewhere more around 3,000, 3,500 nuclear weapons each. However, that never came to pass. When Yeltsin submitted the nuclear armament reduction program to Russia's Federal Assembly, he could not get their approval. Because he was now the head of a democracy, he had to comply with their verdict, and their verdict was no deal. No doubt mistrust existed among Russian politicians, especially those aligned with the Communist Party. Many were spooked by the number of former Soviet countries that had begun joining NATO. Also, a much bigger concern that year was something I referred to earlier, Russia's growing financial crisis. It would have been difficult for Russia at that time to cover the expenses of dismantling large numbers of nuclear warheads. The US Congress at least had better luck with a law passed in November of 1991 just for the United States. It was called the Soviet Threat Reduction Act. Its purpose was to help former Soviet states, like Ukraine, to secure and dismantle their weapons of mass destruction. By the middle of 2013, these 4 former Soviet states had all participated in the US-sponsored disarmament program, US-sponsored and US paid for. And those 4 ex-members of the Soviet Union were Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Albania. Thousands of warheads were deactivated in those 4 countries. Hundreds of intercontinental ballistic missiles destroyed. Also reduced in number were hundreds of missile silos, missile mobile launchers, bombers, French-made nuclear missiles, and submarines that were both nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed. In this program, even nuclear test holes and tunnels were permanently sealed for safety's sake. So Yeltsin had the right idea about reducing Russia's nuclear arms, but right idea, wrong time. A mutual arms reduction agreement between Russia and the United States did finally happen. Anyone want to guess the year it happened?
2018.
You're very close, 2011. In 2011, 4 years, by the way, after Yeltsin's death, a deal was made between our country and Russia. Today, Russia holds a total inventory of approximately 5,000 nuclear warheads. The United States is close behind with about 5,044. When do I have to stop talking? What time exactly?
You have 7 minutes, sister.
Okay, I think I can get this in then. In 2024, Chris Miller wrote a chapter entitled Why Russia's Democracy Broke for a book called When Democracy Breaks, published by Oxford University Press. He maintains that Russia's democracy broke down finally and completely in the years 2003 and 2004. Putin was well into his term of office now as leader of the country. It didn't happen any earlier because, I think partly because in the year 2000, when Putin was first elected, there still was a free press in Russia. And there still were independently owned TV stations and newspapers. My first clue that Russia would change if Putin was elected came from something I learned during my last months in Russia. Probably the biggest employer in the whole city at that time was the steel and iron plant. A friend of mine, Ludmilla, told me that all its employees had been rounded up at a meeting and they were told that if they did not vote for Putin in the spring election, they would lose their jobs. Now here's something you need to know about all of us sisters working in the city at that time. We all had permanent residency permits, something you can't get anymore in Putin's Russia. And those residency permits meant would have allowed us to stay in Russia for life if we wanted to. It also meant that we could vote in elections. After telling me about the threatened factory workers, Ludmilla asked me if I wanted to go vote when that day came up. And I shook my head and said no, because I would probably get myself in trouble by voting for Boris Nemtsov, who, by the way, was later murdered by Putin. When I returned to the US permanently that summer of 2000, the first thing I did was look online for information about Russia's presidential election earlier that year. Guess what I learned? Factory workers all over Russia had been told they would lose their jobs if they did not vote for Putin. He used other tactics to guarantee his election that year too. In the book I referenced earlier, Chris Miller wrote that Putin completely consolidated his power during his first few years in office by establishing firm control over the contents of TV news programs and print newspapers. He was able to block people's access to truthful news sources. When Putin ran again for president in 2012 and won, European election observers noted his win was, and I quote, preordained and unfair because of overwhelming bias in the television media and the use of government money and resources in support of his campaign. European observers also noted that Putin's 4 challengers for the presidency had been unable to secure a fair amount of television coverage or attention, including television coverage for one billionaire whose vast wealth could easily have bought him some coverage in the old days, in the old Yeltsin days. In one curious moment after the election, Putin publicly berated Secretary of State Hillary Clinton by accusing her of personally instigating street protests against him after that 2012 election was over. I find it interesting that he felt so intimidated by a woman that he had to say that. But he did take his revenge later by meddling in her presidential election bid in 2016. He did affect our presidential vote in that year of 2016. And you can learn all about that if you watch the PBS Frontline episode entitled The Election Flash That Fueled Putin's Ire Against Clinton. I don't know if I put that on that handout that I gave you all. So you might want to write this down if it's not there.
It is.
Is there? Okay. The election flash that fueled Putin's ire against Clinton. Okay, let's move ahead to March 30th, 2022. How am I doing on time?
About a minute left.
All right. I have to decide which paragraph I want to rattle off. Well, I'll just go with this one. On March 30th, 2022, when the BBC reported that the Russian government had implemented severe censorship in Russia following Putin's invasion of Ukraine. The state's new actions after they invaded Ukraine included new anti-press laws that forced journalists working for independent media to shut down, go into exile, or face imprisonment. One result was that the always reliable 29-year-old newspaper Novaya Gazeta had to suspend its operations on March 28th of that year. And another Russian newspaper, the Moscow Times, which was one of my favorite newspapers while I was still living over there, they had to move their headquarters to Amsterdam. And you can, I recommend the Moscow Times as a place you can visit online just to check up on Russian news every now and then, and it gives a real deal of what's happening over there. So, with that, I guess I'll conclude.
Our younger people who the departed abruptly. There are Fond du Lac High School students, and apparently we had a miscommunication, and they had to hurry back to Fond du Lac High School campus. So that was the abruptness and the urgency. Secondly, with respect to your feedback sheets, please place them here on the table. And then lastly, before you depart, please join me in thanking Sister Alice for her willingness to share her experience and expertise with all of us this morning. Thank you so much.
After the family is left-handed, all the guys are.